Paul Nola, welcome back. How you doing?
Hi, Alex. I'm good, thank you.
Nice. Great to have you here. And I think you commented as you came in, we've upgraded. We've got the whole setup now. Mark's got his new toys. So
the fancy studio. I said I wasn't coming back unless you upgraded this suite. So you've obviously listened to me.
Exactly. Our number one sort of director of what we need to go.
Is it appearance number 4 now? I think so.
I think so. And for those that haven't seen any of those, although they should go back and watch them, do you just want to give a quick intro to yourself and what you do?
Sure. So Paul Nola, I'm a partner with a consultancy called We Live Context. We conduct research for clients. We've done a lot of work with Moody's over the years, in which we conduct original primary research and write reports on the back of it into the areas of risk, compliance, and all other areas that are relevant to Moody's. So this particular study is on the URM theme and unified risk management, but we've done work recently on KYC, work on artificial intelligence within risk and compliance, entity verification, third-party risk, a whole range of areas.
Yeah, I was going to say, you've been sort of around the house on a number of specific areas, but this one is kind of zooming up a little bit because it's that, as I say, unified risk management. Some people might have an idea of what that means to them, but for those unfamiliar or for those that are wondering what exactly we're going to talk about today, did you have a definition when you went out and did this study?
Yes, absolutely. So we're aware that it's a term that has some traction in the market, but it's not universally known. So we actually put a definition in front of people. Now, if you permit me, I'll read it out. It's quite detailed, but this was something that was shown to people so they could take it in. So we explained that unified risk management is an integrated approach organizations can use when they're assessing and managing risk across third-party relationships, supply chains, and compliance processes. We said that unified risk management consolidates data, automates workflows, and supports cross-functional teams to access the same shared risk intelligence. And finally, that it aims to support more consistent and data-driven decision-making by uncovering both threats and opportunities. So that was the definition. And what was really interesting was, for some people, this was like a breath of fresh air. It's like, wow, somebody's given voice to something that I've been wanting to articulate. Others said, no, this is what we're doing.
Okay.
So again, that shows that there really was a continuum of levels of sophistication towards risk management. And as I said, one of the quotes that people said was, this isn't necessarily a transformational leap. It's an evolutionary step for us. We've been actively on the path and have been for years now. That's the chief risk officer of a big financial services company in Australia that came up with that particular quote. Other people said, this looks really difficult to achieve. So it just goes to show that whilst there is that concept there, people are looking at it from very different perspectives.
So, we'll get into that throughout this discussion, but good to have that definition up front. I think some studies have been survey-based and quite quantitative with then some, with interviews to supplement, but this one was a little bit different. Do you maybe just want to talk through the methodology so as we get into it, people can understand where all this insights come from?
Of course, yes. So on this particular study, we conducted 50 in-depth interviews, one-to-one interviews, usually over Teams, with senior people, generally C-suite, across a whole range of disciplines. So again, as you said, this is a bit of a level up in terms of more of a macro view. And actually, we touch on many of the areas that we've touched on in those other studies all in one. So we cover things like sort of financial and market risk, but we also look at cyber risk and third-party risk, all as part of this. So we spoke to chief risk officers and compliance officers, but also chief data officers and chief information officers, as well as people like chief revenue officers. So really looking at every angle, from the more purely focused on risk to the more revenue focused and everything in between.
And I picked that up as I was looking through the study. I've got it here in front of me as well, just for reference. Well worth a read for anyone who wants to get into the detail after today. But it seemed like it was all sectors, all regions, and as you say, it was that span of functional areas. Was that a deliberate choice for you?
It was a deliberate choice. I think the idea was, in the past perhaps, and even today, right? We all say risk and compliance can be seen as a bit of an area or function that sits in its own silo. And of course, the whole theme of this research is about how leading companies are moving away from that and becoming much more integrated and cohesive and building it in. So risk is no longer just the concern of risk officers and compliance officers. It's about everyone from CEO and CFO through to other parts. So we wanted to represent those stakeholders. And then, yes, just a word on the regional representation. We covered EMEA and Americas were the primary markets, but we also covered APAC. So this research was in a number of areas, and we covered both the financial sector and the non-financial. And I'll go into that a bit later, but we covered 6 subsectors. So this is a pretty broad study, and it is qualitative, to use the research terminology, where we did in-depth interviews, but there's a lot of data underneath here, and so we'll unpick that in the course of this discussion, I hope. And as you say in the report,
I think as I was reading it talked about, you have the qualitative, you have the interview, but with the tools we now have, right? So there's the transcription, there was a codification of these themes, so that there is that. It's not just what was the loudest person; it's actually what was the repetitive, themes that came up. So when I was going through, the first thing that I picked up, once you kind of get through the methodology and this is what we've kind of exec summaried, but there was this idea of 5 factors really that kind of form under the umbrella of unified risk management. And they all operate on a continuum. And I thought that was quite an interesting idea, because often in this world, as many people say, like, people are forced into it's this or it's that, it's black or it's white, or et cetera, et cetera. And actually most things are kind of more nuanced than that, and our continuums are a very good way to represent that. Could you maybe talk through those factors and the continuums that you were sort of seeing, and any comment you sort of remember from the interviews with these leaders?
Yeah, of course. So when you do any form of research, especially in business markets like this, there's so many different nuances, variables. And the thing that we're always trying to get our clients to stop doing is to stop saying they. There's a tendency to say, customers say this, people think that. The reality is it's not like that. It's not black and white. So whenever we do a piece of research like this, we try to identify those key variables. And as you said, there's 5 that really jump out from this research, which shape the different approaches to this theme. So the first is, in a way, quite obvious, is, are you actually a financial services organization whose main business is dealing with financial instruments, with dealing with money, or are you a so we talked to corporates and professional services companies. So, and we didn't talk to governments on this instance, but we have done government as well. So financial, non-financial, are you operating in a local or regional space, or do you have a very international, fully global or multi-region remit? So that's a really important difference, because again, when it comes to the theme of risk, one of the great quotes that came out of this was somebody said, we work across APAC and we're dealing with everything in terms of specification, from markets that are cutting edge AI all the way through to pen and paper, all within one region. And you can imagine within APAC, you've got a whole gamut of markets. So even that's a real difference. And the more countries you cover, the more complexity you have, and obviously different risk frameworks and regulations you have to deal with.
Yeah, I think that word complexity, right? Because we probably do that region a disservice calling it APAC and going, it's that, rather than, no, there's such a collection and diversity there, versus we have diversity in Europe, but there is a sort of maybe a closer standard when you look at a regional lens, or through a regional lens, I should say.
I think with APAC also, you've got a whole range of issues, which we've encountered in previous studies. So you've got not just different languages, but different alphabets. That also plays into the challenge of interpreting documentation. And as you said, the level of technological advancement or digital transformation varies from markets like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, compared to Australia, Singapore, markets that might be more in the vanguard. But yeah, so there's that area of how international are you? That differentiates people. Are you in a very regulated space? So not just the financial world, which is heavily regulated, but for example, we interviewed people in the pharmaceutical space, right? Yeah. So pharmaceutical, hugely regulated, and that really has impact for how risk is perceived, where there's organizations which are in much less regulated spaces. Then the final 2 variables really were more attitudinal, you could say. So, attitude and behavioral, but do they have very, good digital transformation? Have they got good data in place? How automated are they? Some companies are very manual, some are more automated. And the final one is really important, which is this a space where it's compliance that's in charge of this? So it's more like a policing function, or is it a company where there's C-suite ownership, where it's seen as a more strategic, what's the word? A strategic governing space.
Part of the overall decision making, rather than, we often talk about don't be a box ticker.
Correct.
Box ticking, right? So I know it still exists. I know sometimes it can feel easier. At least I did my bit, but it doesn't really help when you're trying to actually change something or really mitigate something. It just means that it's that backside covering attitude that less said the better. So just to sum up those 5 continuums of the sector continuum, or the focus of that sector: scale and complexity, and you talked about sort of the globalization effect or being more local, the regulatory intensity depending on different industries, digital and data maturity, which is funny after our last study where we talked about that data readiness and AI readiness. And then finally, and maybe this is actually the top one, as ever with everything, is your leadership culture. So I think figuring out where you are on each of those for anyone listening could be quite illuminating for where would you sit, or how ready are you to sort of take a unified risk management approach, because everyone, and it seemed quoted in there, all agree that unified risk management is needed.
Yes.
It's just hard to do. And therefore this study, I think, helps get to the heart of what you might need to factor in. Let's talk about a word you mentioned. You mentioned Vanguard a second ago, and I believe that was the name given to sort of one of 3 buckets or tranches of those you spoke to, of organizations on another continuum.
Yes.
Right? Can you talk a little bit about that maturity curve and why 3 rather than 4 or 5? Or I'm just interested how you got to those 3 types of organization in your classification.
Yeah, I think when we do research with Moody's, we often try to understand the spectrum of organizations in terms of where they are in terms of advancement, development. I'll be honest, it's not overly scientific. It just makes sense that even doing the research, you could see when we were conducting the interviews that you're talking to an organization that's really thinking ahead, that's teaching us stuff as we hear them. You're talking to an organization where the individual speaking to really feels frustration. It's like, I wish management would listen to me, but I'm just seen as a policeman. And it's worth saying that policeman analogy is used a lot around compliance. It's not usually because of the compliance people wanting it to be that. It's almost like an organizational culture. It's like, oh, well, they're just there to do that, and they're not given maybe as much authority as they could have. And then in the middle, you've got a lot of companies that are sort of somewhere on that spectrum. So that's where he came out with, the Vanguard. It's like a normal distribution. You've got around 10 to 15% in that Vanguard. These are companies where they have a really wide view of risk. They are, if not completely there, they're definitely ahead of the pack in terms of better tools, a more integrated approach, but also a wider set of voices around the table, more senior people around the table setting the agenda. So as I said, that's about 10 to 15%. At the other extent, we've probably got a little bit more, 20 to 25%, where risk is seen as nothing more than compliance, and probably no one gets particularly excited about it because it's seen as that. And then the pack is obviously 60, 75 to 75%. These are organizations where you see different levels of integration and maturity, things coalescing. But the thing I would say is that pack is a big group. And obviously you could break the pack into, because obviously this is all drawn on the classic Rogers, I think it was the academic Everett Rogers came up with a diffusion of innovation. Okay. So in that, there's a we always talk about early adopters. So that's five phases. Innovators is actually a tiny proportion. Then the early adopters, and then you've got the early and late majority, and then the laggards. So we just coalesced that a little bit.
Slightly simplified. So for someone to go from being a laggard into the pack versus from the pack into the Vanguard, are there different things they would do, or is it sort of the same thing and then you just keep improving to continue to mature along that curve?
I think, to some extent it is. To some extent, it's a linear progression. But the reality with any of these things is there is also a little bit of a break in the curve, and you've got to almost jump the chasm, to use another term. So probably what's helpful in this is to say, what does the Vanguard look like? What's that small group of companies? And again, through the research, when we did our analysis, we found 5 key. Again, I don't know why 5 is coming out. 5 and 3, usually those are the numbers. So 5 key factors. First of all, they treat risk in an interconnected way. So that word interconnected is really interesting because we've heard different terms, exponential, systematic, whatever, but interconnected as opposed to isolated, rather than treating risk in individual buckets. They look at it in a more, as I said, more joined up way. Really important one is, rather than seeing this as a defensive posture, you can see that they consider it a strategic, like a way of getting an advantage. That for me was really eye-opening, because too often I've had interviews where it's like, what if the worst happens? These organizations aren't saying that. They're saying, how can we get a competitive advantage by treating risk in a different way? As I said, the other one which I think is worth mentioning is vanguard organizations don't just look at compliance and will we get in trouble, but also they look at it as a business continuity and resilience topic. So if we can get our risk processes right and we can understand all the complex realm of risks out there as well as possible and manage those, that helps us to stay resilient and keep running. One of the things I think came out as a quote was, we can take a bad quarter financially, but a week with our systems being down will kill us. So resilience and business continuity really came out as a big theme. Yeah. I'd say particularly within the corporate space. Yeah, big corporations, obviously, with extended supply chains. So that was 3. The fourth one was having a data-driven rather than a manual approach to systems. So not just having sort of spreadsheets and tools that don't work together. And then the final one is, I've slightly mentioned it before, it's having a boardroom level view. So I suppose if you were going to create a recipe, you would say, first of all, start drilling up your risk approach, start getting the senior people in the business to really own it and to drive it from the top down.
Yeah, maybe that's the first one, right?
Well, yes, absolutely.
Get that one in place, because everything else you've mentioned there is going to require some level of spend or effort. You could think of both of those as spend, right? And you're using people's time. That is what you're paying them for. And you're not going to be able to get the systems, whether that be the data, whether that be the automation, whether that be the risk assessment, etc. Getting out of Excel, getting out of PowerPoint. You're not going to be able to do any of that without leaders that go, either here's the budget or come to me when you need something signed off. Yes,
definitely. I mean, we've done a number of projects over the last few years with Moody's. One was on entity verification, and that we asked a very particular question. That was a survey-based project. We found that the organizations that, again, were the most advanced were those where ownership for risk sat at a board member, and not just, should we say, a middle management functional area. So again, it all sits together. The more you have that top-down view, the more, is it a correlational causality? That's the way to think. But I think companies where you have that approach from the top drive changes through, because it's not easy to do. You need to have a lot of will and motivation to make this happen. That's the other thing you see. There's a lot of organizations in that pack that are trying to do the right things, but it's just a difficult journey. Yeah. So, takes a lot of joined up effort to make it happen.
Right. So I'm going to double click on a couple of things. I shouldn't use that phrase because I say I hate it, but it's somehow entered the lexicon and I've started using it. But I'm going to pick you up on a point that you made. You mentioned interconnectedness. And I feel like that was the key thing we really spoke about when we were talking about the sort of data readiness and AI study, where if you don't have your master data management and your data systems in place, and you can't really do the really cool stuff on top of it. And it sounds like it's similar here. If you haven't got the way that you ingest your, whether it be entity verification data, whether it be other risk insights, whether it be your transaction data from some other system, those things can't work together, then sounds like you can have all the ideas in the world and all the leadership ambition, but you're going to struggle. Yeah. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think master data management did come out of this topic as well, that unless you've got your data organized, lined up, codified, with a sort of key record, key identifiers in place, everything else struggles to happen. And you said the thing that came out a lot through the research was so many organizations basically almost ranting at me and my colleagues when we were doing an interview saying it's really frustrating because we can't get this stuff to work. So yes, that definitely came out, that having a single customer view, the so-called golden record, all of that is an imperative sort of enabler, a foundational point. But again, so many organizations do struggle to have that in place.
I will say, for anyone that was very frustrated with you or is banging their laptops or their headphones or whatever they're listening to this on or watching on, go back and watch the data interoperability episode we did with Ian Godfrey, and go onto our YouTube channel and watch the conversation we had with SAP, where we're talking about a lot of this stuff about how to get the data interconnected or taking steps towards that, and then what you can do on top. Because I think there's a lot of lessons there, and it's not necessarily rocket science. It can be high effort, but if you know what the plan is, then you just got to decide if you want to do it and if you can find enough supporters in your business to do so. So I think there's some really good things in there that would build on top of what we're discussing now. The other point I wanted to pick up on was continuity. And I wrote to myself here on my note on my annotation version of the report is continuity is king. And yeah, I wanted to, well, I kind of know the answer. Is that right? Because in the report, it seems to say it is. But could you maybe just reflect on me saying that maybe as a title, continuity is king?
Continuity is king, yeah. I think we found from talking to organizations, actually both financial and non-financial entities, that the thing that petrifies leadership teams more than anything else is downtime. And downtime and a breakage in the flow of doing business. And what we found, one of the things that came out to really highlight this, 2 particular risks came out. So we can talk a bit later about the league table of risks, but not all risks are created equal. There's a whole range of risks. Everyone listening to this will know them, be able to trot them off, from governance risk and market risk, financial risk, and compliance, everything else. The 2 that came out as being particularly difficult are the cyber risk and operational risk. And that operational obviously connects to third-party risk as well. So why are those particularly important? Because if you don't have a clear view of, those cyber protection measures, clearly, people are very, very worried about that. There's a massive rise in the nature of the threat, the attack surface, as it's described. All of the cyber risks can cripple you, as you know, but then also operational risks. And operational risks can take lots of different guises. So one thing that I thought was interesting was, when we talk about climate risks, sometimes people say, hey, climate, it's all about green, and do you believe in it? And not. It's not that at all. Climate risk means if you have, for example, wildfires affecting your factories or flooding, one of the organizations I spoke to said they literally had a river running through their suppliers, production facility. That meant they couldn't get their products, their supply chain was interrupted. So operational risks can arise from a whole range of areas. And again, bringing that into the fold is important, because it's all very well having companies that are financially solvent. Well, they will be until an operational factor renders them inoperative.
Yeah. And downtime, often a lot of people hear that and they think software, but I think what you're talking about is it could be your software systems, but it could also be your factory. It could also be your logistics.
Correct.
Or your third-party logistics provider. Many people outsource that, right? So any form of thing where your business or part of your business grinds to a halt.
Yeah, exactly.
Is actually what's keeping people more worried than their finance report.
Yes. And again, it's one of the things that we did. So we talked about this, if it's okay to the league table of risk. So in the research, one thing we did was we literally said, talk to me about these different areas of risk. We even had a stimulus slide where we showed, so in that, we had financial credit risks, physical and environmental risks. We had things like regulatory and compliance risks. I'm just looking at the list now to remind myself: geopolitical, macroeconomic factors, third party, reputational risk. I haven't mentioned that yet. Reputation risk is often the one that is cited, particularly by corporations, meaning the likes of Unilever or whoever else who have a big brand and a big public image to worry about. And then things like insurance and resilience risks. And so we asked people to talk about those. And what we found was the way professionals tend to consider them is, firstly, what's the level of impact of that risk on our organization? But secondly, how easy or how difficult is it to manage? How well have we got that particular risk nailed down?
So impact and difficulty as your 2 axes.
And that, exactly. And so, you've got areas maybe like financial and market risk or regulatory risk, which definitely have a big impact on you. But most companies have got systems in place. It's almost like a known, to quote Donald Rumsfeld. That's an area where we know there's a risk, so we've got that locked down. Then you've got areas that are in that top quadrant, the sort of hard to manage critical risks, we call them. And that really is cyber risk, third party operational risk, and reputational risk. They're the ones which both have a big impact, but often companies find harder to manage.
And all those risks are, back to that word, interconnected, right?
Correct.
Because you have your own cyber risk and attacks that your InfoSec team will be trying to defend, but I've mentioned on this podcast this year, right? A lot of the stuff that's been in the news, people are getting hacked not through their own systems, it's through their third-party systems that then is connected to theirs, and so on and so on. We've talked about the open letter that JP Morgan's InfoSec lead wrote, saying we're going to now judge you on your security more than your features. And there's various other examples. People can go back and listen for those. But therefore, cyber risk is an inherent and critical part of your vendor onboarding, your vendor monitoring. And when I say vendors, that then has implications for your supply chain. So you need to know their vendors as well, because what other downstream risk have you got of that?
Well, and it works in both directions, actually. Just as you were talking through that, it reminded me of one of the most interesting interviews I personally conducted. And that was with a chief risk officer working in a global contract research organization. So in other words, they have laboratories which they're an external research partner to big healthcare pharmaceutical companies. So you can imagine the level of regulation and scrutiny is enormous. The thing that really worried them was if there's any issues with their own cyber systems, because if they then caused an issue among one of their, massive global pharmaceutical clients, they really struggle to recover from that.
Yeah.
So sometimes you think about the cyber risk in that direction of flowing up to your client. Other times it's the client, the contractor saying, where are the chinks of armor in my supply chain? Because any number of those systems are interconnected. So again, you're just, as ever, Alex, you're sort of stimulating thoughts. But the thing that's, one thing we could say is why is now a particularly interesting time? And just stepping back, we said to organizations, what's going on? What's happening? How is the environment? And universally, they said, it is a really challenging time for a couple of reasons. And I think we tried to codify it. So on the one hand, it's a time where there have been external factors. Obviously, we've been through a pandemic. We've been through, and we're still going through lots of geopolitical uncertainty with wars in different regions and all of the things that I think people are generally aware of. But then that couples with a time of huge digital transformation. So there's much more technological interdependency between organizations, the use of AI, of course. So that term that I think it comes from the cyber industry, the attack surface, the vulnerable potential area of your business is growing at a time of uncertainty. And that means that all those fragmented systems among companies that are a little bit lower down the sort of pecking order, that aren't the vanguards, are really coming under scrutiny. They're starting to crack because they haven't necessarily locked them down well enough. So when bring a cricket analogy, when you're playing on an easy wicket, it's not too hard. Yeah. But once things become difficult, as this time undoubtedly is, that's when the weaknesses really come to the fore. And that's why more and more companies are starting to elevate this, and senior leadership teams say, actually, we need to grab this issue by the scruff of the neck.
For those not in England or Australia, I apologise for the cricket analogy. Paul and I were talking sports beforehand and trying to think of the American version where we have about 50% of our listeners. But baseball obviously doesn't rely on the ground. The ball flies through the air. So I'm not sure.
I think, apologies for using cricket. But I mean, effectively, when it's easy, when things are relatively easy, you can get away with things. Yeah. But at the moment, you can't get away with things. Yeah. That's the message we heard.
Well, I actually got the chance to be a guest on somebody else's podcast for a change, Supply Chain Now, and we were talking about sort of lessons from third party and KYC for sort of supply chain and procurement professionals. And it's kind of where I ended up going, was like, we talked about data management a lot, but also things that we're seeing is like the coalescence of all of the cyber risk and AI allowing you to do more of them at scale.
Yes.
And that being leveraged by fraudsters,
of course,
who are going, well, I could try and defraud Paul for, a few $1,000s, pounds, euros, whatever, and I could try and find lots of pools. Or I could just go to a number of companies and go for much bigger ticket items, and I've only got to be successful once, and that's my year or multiple years of pay.
Yes.
And so, as you say, you've got this kind of perfect storm of high complexity, risk teams running around trying to manage everything, and then criminal groups thinking, they're distracted.
Yes.
And there's all this tooling, which means I can now stay at a safe distance and just try again and again and again. And so you've got to make sure that your own systems are in order. But as you said, also that your value chain up and down and sideways from your business is also not revealing chinks in the armor as much as you can, right? I'm not pretending that like this is one, easy, or two, that it's possible to have a perfect system, but they often say you need to what do they say? You've only got to outrun your friend or
yes,
or your pack mate
being chased by a bear.
Yeah, exactly. At least until the next one, and yeah.
I think on that point, you're reminding me of something we talked about on the AI study, because obviously organizations there is often a top-down imperative from CEOs and boards to say we must be rolling out AI to increase efficiency and improve effectiveness. But one of the big challenges is where does that data go? Yeah. And so actually one thing that we started to see, this overlaps a little bit with the work we do with technology clients, is the growth of things like sovereign cloud systems, where you have a cloud, but it's protected so the data remains within a certain jurisdiction. There's no chance of it leaking out of there. And increasingly now, things like sovereign AI as well. So building AI systems where your data is guaranteed to remain within a certain system. All of this points to that real concern among senior leadership teams of what's happening to our data, to our customers' data. And again, if it's in the space of healthcare, to our patients' data, even more. So the stakes go up.
It starts to become personal, right? There's business and then there's personal. And
absolutely. Yeah. And if you're betraying personal secrets, you're really going to have trouble. So as I said, cyber risk, massive, third-party operational risk. But again, you talked about interconnectedness. The most interconnected risk of all is reputational risk, as I see it. Because reputational risk can come as a result of any of the other risks.
Yeah.
So if it turns out that you've got, child labor in your supply chain, that's a huge reputational blow. If you had we've seen massive organizations whose systems have been down for literally weeks because of cyber outages. So all of that blows up in your face. So, in a way, for me, it all ladders up to reputational risk because you're trying to avoid that. And that's particularly important for companies that have a publicly traded and publicly known brand.
Yeah, well, that's to the consumer. I suppose also, though, to use your other example, if you're a lab or a specialist provider, you might have an incredible business and some incredible clients, but if you're a smaller fish in the value chain, then like one bad move and that biggest client could go, and then you're really struggling. We talked before we started, right, about the different stages of a business going from sort of up to 20 employees and then getting to 50 and then that. And if you're highly specialized, but you get something wrong during that 20 period, you're struggling.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't mention earlier, but another one of the variables in terms of our sampling was we did talk to organizations of different sizes as well. So when you're at the really large corporate space, you've got many thousands of employees, you tend to have a lot more regimented systems in place that may limit your flexibility a little bit, make you a bit more rigid, but also means you've got a degree of certainty. You're absolutely right to say for those companies that are more in the middle of the market, let's say with maybe between 100 and 1,000 staff, often those companies are still evolving. They're trying to prove themselves, they're trying to grow. And I think that's also interesting in the context of fintechs, because within our sample, we didn't just talk to the established banks, asset and wealth managers, insurers, although we did cover them. We also spoke to fintechs, and fintechs are often at the opposite end of a bank. The way we characterized bank through our research was the generally mature risk approaches, but slightly rigid and often hemmed in by legacy systems. Fintechs at the other end, they're incredibly agile, but they're often loosely governed, and they're at the bleeding edge. To use another sort of term, they need more regulation. So that's typical of companies that are smaller, that are growing, where maturity hasn't quite caught up with business growth.
Yeah, well, let's get into that. So, let's talk about the operational challenges. I picked up some themes as I was reading the report, but for you, were there sort of a top 3, perhaps, or 5 things that were like, these are the ones that came up again and again, almost not regardless of the size industry, because I think that's very interesting nuances. But just a top few that
of course
people have got to solve to get on top of this unified risk management approach.
Well, again, we definitely did try to understand what the challenges were. And this time, actually, just to change it up, we found 4 major challenges. So we not just 3 or 5. I think for a lot of companies, keeping pace with the shift in risk management is really difficult. 4 challenges, I think. The first was you could call structural challenges, just in terms of the business organization. As I said, we talked a lot about silos and departments and just organizations that aren't set up to address that risk in a more unified way. Then there's the data and technology challenges, which we've sort of hinted at quite a lot. There's cultural challenges, so culture and behavior, just how organizations think and feel and act. And finally, there's just challenge in terms of capability and execution as well. So when you put all of that together, the things that came up the most often were things like legacy structures, outdated tools, and also very narrow ownership models that prevent risk management from sort of matching the pace of change, really.
Okay. So I guess, I noted down, and maybe some of these are the same, some of these maybe are symptoms of those, but it was like the word integration, as well as interconnectedness, and maybe they're synonyms or maybe they're just closely related, but it came up again and again in all the quotes. Like, we've got to have these tools, these insights, this data integrated. Speed, right? And we just talked about maybe a fintech moving very quickly, but without maybe enough governance or with less governance. And then others moving quite slowly, which also creates its own risk, because by the time you've done the change, the risk's moved on and you need to do next one. So you always end up chasing your tail. And the other one was visibility. I wrote down for myself here on the report of just, we talk, and I think this comes back to the leadership point, right? Do you have access to all leaders across the organization, to the board above them? And is everyone they've got to be aware of it through the visibility, and then they've actually got to be motivated to do something, which comes from the culture and the expectations of the whole reporting line. I think those are the bits I took, and it's sort of interesting to hear the person that was doing the interviews and writing the report, and then me as a sort of consumer of it, get into those. I think the other thing we've kind of talked about it. I was going to say, I want to talk a little bit more about supply chains, but we've kind of been talking about third party and value chain. And is there anything else you'd add? I'm conscious of time. But.
I guess the thing that comes around with supply chains, I think I've mentioned it before. We did a piece of work for Moody's maybe 3 or 4 years ago now on third party risk management. Obviously, the big change there was the fact that organizations are now responsible for risks that occur any number of tiers down their supply chain. So that has really had the impact of blowing up the number of risks that are possible. So the whole area with supply chain is visibility into the full level. I know there are tools to do that, but that's particularly challenging when you're dealing with supply chains that have lots of small companies that may be in countries, further away, less regulated environments. So, that definitely is something I'd pull out, because, again, any problem in your supply chain can result in operational outages or reputational damage or mixture of the two.
Well, I think that's the thing about this report, but also all the reports you and the team do, Paul, is that it's great information, but it does, I think, definitely drive people to then take an action, or at least consider one, right? We can't make people do things, but we can provide the information, hopefully provide some education, or sometimes I wonder if we're telling people things they know because they feel and see these things every day, but gives them the validation to go, look, it's not just us.
Yes.
And here are some leaders, as you say, vanguards that we could follow. So thank you for doing this and putting this together for us and all the people that follow Moody's and their content. If someone wants to read the report in full, which I encourage them to, where would you push them to or send them to?
The Moody's website has got a section dedicated to all of the reports I've been talking about. And there is I'm sure the link can be made available,
of course,
along with this. So you can access a sort of white paper type report. There are also infographics with some of the data visualizations. There are interesting outputs that can give you lots of input on this. And there's a webinar coming up in January when I'll be presenting some of the findings of this research, and we'll be going into detail about some of these issues. So another opportunity to get familiar with the outputs of this work.
Fantastic. So those that have listened to watch, thank you. You've got a taste. There's the report to go read for those that like documentation, or for those more visual, come watch the webinar, and hopefully this helps you think about where you are on unified risk management and what you can do to get to the next level of maturity. Paul, thank you so much for coming in again.
Thank you, Alex. It's been a pleasure.